Part 1. Day 3, 1800 hours to 2400 hours. Bernice sighed, sat down on the mahogany rocking chair, and put her feet on the TARDIS console. The TARDIS hummed, a gentle purr like a pet cat. Although it was the product of a highly advanced race, the Time Lords, the machine was currently behaving in an erratic and temperamental manner. The control room was sparsely furnished with the central console, a chair, and a hat stand. The Doctor had at least 3 other hat stands dotted around the ship. He had at one time claimed to be collecting them. "Doctor, are you playing?" she asked. It looked like she was going to win another game of chess. "Yes." "And you can act your age and put your feet down." When the Doctor was annoyed, in his usual spluttering way, he talked too fast and everything came out in a drifting Scottish accent. He didn't like losing. He walked to the chessboard and stared at the black pieces surrounding his white king. "Is it my move?" The Doctor was increasingly distant. His mind seemed to wander as she talked to him. Twice recently, she had found him standing in the TARDIS corridors, staring at the ceiling. She ordinarily took the Doctor with a pinch of salt when he was in a mood, but this behaviour was strange, even for him. He had murmured to her about past experiences hanging about him. Bernice thought the Doctor was a lonely man, and when his mind dwelt on old friends, he became unbearable. Apparently, without the Doctor noticing, Bernice had managed to move a pawn across the chessboard and promote it to a queen. He picked up her new queen, put it down, walked off, and lay on the floor underneath the console. "What are you doing, Doctor?" He pulled the sonic screwdriver from his pocket and began to tamper with the TARDIS control mechanisms. He ignored her question. "Where do you want to go?" "I'd like to finish this game of chess." "Chess?" he shouted at her, as if he'd forgotten they were in the middle of a game. She decided she would have won anyway, and if he was offering her the opportunity of choosing a destination, she would make use of it. "I'd like to go to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, to the dark places or the uncharted wilderness. I'd like to explore the unknown. I keep asking myself the same question, Doctor. Is this all there is?" The Doctor looked irritated. "But time travel is so exciting. You can travel to the cradles of civilization and see what really happened. How were women treated in those days? What did people do for money? As an archaeologist, you must appreciate the potential. What about the beauty of the universe? The fiery suns, the spectral asteroid belts, and the lone worlds bubbling with chemicals that will give birth to life. I could take you to Mars before mankind walked the Earth." "I'd like to go to the 7 planets," she said. He wasn't listening to her. "Are you listening?" Yes, Bernice. Could you pass me the weasel flirt?" "The what?" She looked underneath the console. He was pulling out wires, putting them together, and seeing if there was a spark. There was a loud bang, and the Doctor shot out of his temporary workplace. His face was covered in soot. "That's fine," he said, standing up. He took a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his brow. He smiled at her and raised his eyebrows. "Bernice, wouldn't it be nice to stay at home, drink tea and read the papers?" "I'd like to do that, but I can't." He raised his voice on the final 2 words. He walked out of the console room whistling a tune which she recognised but couldn't place. The Doctor was slightly over 1.5 metres tall. He had a mop of curly brown hair and a cheeky grin. He wore checked trousers, invariably too big for him, a white shirt, and red braces imprinted with question marks. He seemed like a circus performer, and had a shuffling walk which gave the impression he was balancing on a tightrope, swaying in the wind. She could trust the Doctor, unlike most men. He had taken her on many adventures. He was an old romantic, and the universe had precious few of them. "What are the 7 planets?" The Doctor had walked in, having washed his face. She had managed to interest the Doctor in her suggestion. Anything to escape from the TARDIS. There was something disturbing about it, not quite right. 50 years before my time, an entire solar system was destroyed," Bernice said. "I've always wondered what happened." Some say that it was a meteorite, others that it was a terrible civil war. I've never heard of it. Nicaea, 2400. He looked concerned. Why have I never heard of it? The star charts on the TARDIS had no record of the solar system, but many of the Earth colony worlds would never have been charted before the colonists arrived. Bernice pointed out to the Doctor where the planets could be found. He programmed the TARDIS. I want to know why the TARDIS has no record of this system, said the Doctor. She smiled to herself and then began to wonder. Where had she heard of the 7 planets, she thought. But all she knew was she had always wanted to go there. She shook her head. What was she worrying about? Suddenly the lights began to flicker, and the sound of machines grinding to a halt interrupted their conversation. Doctor, she said. The TARDIS was still playing up. This is most unusual, he replied, running over to the console. He pointed to a warning light flashing on and off. Another TARDIS. But the light quickly went out, as did all the lights on the ship's console. Complete all systems breakdown, the Doctor said. He looked underneath the console at his repairs and urgently tested various wires and microchips. When that didn't work, he kicked the console. The ship darkened. Doctor? She wasn't particularly worried, but sometimes it was necessary to make sure the Doctor hadn't been entranced by a hideous proposition which threatened a whole civilization but which he, temporarily, found interesting. Aren't you going to do anything? She asked. Sometimes there isn't anything you can do. Let's wait and see, the Doctor said, sitting on the chair and putting his feet on the console. The funeral had been quick and efficient. Although death was not unusual on recently colonized worlds, Carlson always found the process of laying the body to rest unpleasant. He stood at the corner of the plot and watched the electronic pallbearers lower the coffin into the ground. The priest mumbled a lamentation. The parents were distraught. The husband held on to his wife. She couldn't let her child go. She fell to her knees by the grave. She was begging for the prime mover, the supreme deity, to intervene and return their daughter. The priest was silent. He seemed embarrassed. The assembled crowd started to sing, "Shall we gather at the river?" The husband tried to calm her, but she needed answers. Why? She looked at the crowd. Why, my child? The wonderful river of God, the mourners sang on. Carlson looked around. There were 43 mourners. The deceased was a 19-year-old girl. She had started college, training to be an agricultural advisor, learning how to turn the virtually barren earth into fertile soil. She and her boyfriend had been talking about marriage. She was from a nice home and had everything to live for. But it wasn't to be. Her badly mutilated body had been found by the side of a dirt track. It had taken days to identify her. There had been no sexual attack. The injuries were not consistent with an attack by a hunter or any other animal. Carlson could understand the uneasy silence at the funeral. The crowd was in shock. They couldn't explain what had happened to this beautiful girl. He had searched her connapt. Other justice police officers had searched the parents' and the boyfriend's apartments. There had been no clues. He had come to the funeral to observe the mourners. Automatic cameras had scanned the crowd. Later the information would be examined and cross-referenced. Although Carlson only knew her from photographs and her possessions tidied away in her room, he felt the sadness and despair of the crowd. Life on a frontier world was like balancing on the edge of a precipice. The hymn had finished. The father held his wife tightly. Carlson knew that they were both believers. The book told of the eternal battle between the prime mover and the form manipulator. Would the girl's parents see this as a victory for evil? The mourners drifted away. The priest returned to the church. Carlson walked up to the parents. An electronic digger was filling the grave. There was an uneasy silence. "Major," said the father, "thank you for coming." "I'm sorry," Carlson replied. He didn't know what else to say. The mother looked at him. "You bastard!" she screeched, slapping him across the face. She burst into tears again. The father muttered his apologies and pulled his wife from the graveside. Carlson was left alone with his thoughts. The mother had to blame someone, and why not him? There was no one else. He looked down into the pit. We all have to die sometime, he thought. If our lives have any significance, then it comes from what we do whilst alive. He spoke a quick prayer. He felt strange, as if being watched. The temperature over the last few days had started to become unbearably hot, and it was starting to affect his thought processes. His throat was dry, he needed a drink. He would feel better after a drink. At that distance, secure within the confines of the spaceship, Thomas took a great interest in the unfolding events on Nicaea. His planet was about to erupt into civil war. Even watching the daily vidscreen broadcasts, where the elite talked about peace and there was no mention of the conflict between the priesthood and the academy, he knew that the war would be coming. The military had been put on standby in their barracks, even though there were concerns about which side the troops would fight on. The Justice Police had been ordered to monitor and watch all unusual activities on the 7 planets, and at the first sign of conflict, all rebels, agitators, and those suspected of being such would be... He didn't know. He was not privy to the machinations of his controllers. Under the leadership of the main colony world, Nicaea, the 6 inhabited planets had recently gained independence from one of the major Earth corporations. Thomas felt that he was safe from the conflict, which raged across the Althosian star system. "Getting nervous?" Marilyn asked. "Yes," he replied. "They must know we'd come after them." Her eyes were staring at him. He tried to look away, but was forced to keep on sneaking a glance to see if her gaze had altered. She was 2 meters tall, with cropped blonde hair and a muscular build. She stared at him with her cold blue eyes like a snake trying to hypnotize its prey. Suddenly there was a pain in his back. He had been kicked. Spike screamed, "Pay attention!" Marilyn was still looking at him. She stood up and smiled. She was ridiculing him. "What do you think you're playing at?" Spike looked at all 3 of them. "Down there you'd all be dead now. You need to be constantly vigilant. What were you playing at?" Marilyn turned her attention to him. "Just testing Loverboy out." Thomas now knew he couldn't trust her, and he didn't like it. The group had to rely on each other, bury their personal differences and work together. Perhaps it was a mistake to put 4 killers on the same mission. Sometimes it was difficult to see what his controllers were trying to accomplish. They must have some hidden purpose, and perhaps the conflict on board the ship was part of it. Marilyn held 2 fingers up in the shape of a gun and pretended to shoot him. She mouthed the commander's words. "Down there you're dead." Spike glared at her. The dense foliage rendered the wildlife invisible. As Elle took off her clothes, she stared into the trees, listening to the scuttling sounds of a multitude of small creatures. She wondered if there were any other intelligent life forms on this overgrown rainforest of a world. She found the thought disturbing somehow. Part of her mind told her not to think it. Her husband stood at the laboratory table in the middle of the glade. His test tubes and charts lay strewn over the table. A computerized microscope analyzed the endless stream of figures and results. He uttered occasional grunts of surprise. The glade was next to the river. Elle had been swimming every day since their arrival on the planet. Although the water was a dirty grey colour, it kept her clean in the humid climate. She paused on the bank, looked at her husband, and dived in. It had been continuously light since they had arrived. The twin suns of the Althosian system meant that only every 7 days was the planet plunged into darkness. This was very different from her normal work as a secretary for the state publishing company. It was difficult earning enough money to cover the cost of basic food. At least her husband also brought home a wage. As a government scientist, he worked more than the regulated 3 hours a day. She spent most of her time looking after their connapt, cleaning it and making it seem like one of the homes featured on the afternoon vidscreen broadcasts. She'd never thought that she would leave Nicaea again. 28 was too old to be discovering that she enjoyed adventure. "Come on in," Elle shouted to her husband. "Don't drink any of it," he replied, as if he hadn't heard what she had said. She splashed him with water. "Stop it," he muttered, not looking up as he continued to type his findings into the computer. Huge black trees shadowed the clearing in the pool of water. She looked skywards, but couldn't see the roof of the forest. "This liquid isn't H2O, Jarek said. He looked around for her, having forgotten in a matter of seconds where she was. She clambered out of the water and picked up her towel. She walked over to Jarek and dripped over his charts and maps. She looked at his receding hairline and emaciated appearance. "Put some clothes on," he said. "You've seen me like this before." Although she taunted him, she wasn't proud of her body. She was embarrassed about the effects of malnutrition, the planet's distance from the twin suns, and the chemical additives in the Nicaean water supply. "Yes, but there's nobody else on the planet to see." He seemed dissatisfied with her words. His eyes flickered nervously. His mind twitched again. "Have you seen this?" He produced a glass slide and placed it in the microscope. "Go on, look." She looked at a close-up of swirling patterns. "What am I looking at?" she asked. He produced another slide from the tangle of rubbish on his desk. She studied the new slide. "There's nothing on this one." He nodded frantically. "These are samples of river water taken 2 days apart. The first slide was taken this evening. The second slide was taken yesterday morning. Something's happening in the river." She lowered the towel to cover her body. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I've been swimming." "In that?" "Yes." Elle was used to his absent-mindedness. Again she heard that noise. She could hear the sound of a machine in the upper atmosphere. But this is a banned world. There can't be any other visitors, she thought. I must remember that. The TARDIS was silent and still. It hadn't moved for over an hour. It had stopped in time and space. According to the ship's monitors, they were almost at their destination. They were in the Orthosian planetary system. The Doctor was stretched out. His eyes were closed, and he was snoring. His lack of interest in their plight made Bernice extremely angry. She walked up and down the console room, thinking how terrifying it would be to spend all eternity trapped with her complacent companion in deep space. "Does nothing frighten you, Doctor?" she muttered underneath her breath. "The lack of hope," he replied, as if he had been wide awake all the time. He swung his legs around and looked at her. "That point when there's no hope left. You know, Doctor, I used to hate watching 20th century films and seeing the words, 'the end,'" she said. Although interactive holovids were the main source of home entertainment, Bernice collected old movies and watched them repeatedly. What happens to those people after the film's finished? Those films were so finite. Yeah, things can't be changed. I remember that I'd watch The Great Escape to see if other people would escape. I always got upset when Donald Pleasance was shot at the end. Why couldn't they do a version where he survives? Because there's no justice. In real life, good people die as well. But never give up hope. I fancy a jelly baby. I haven't had one for ages. Whenever he thought of something serious, Bernice thought, he would suddenly become frivolous. He stood up, distracted. "I wonder what is happening here. Why aren't we moving?" The Doctor held up a moth-eaten red velvet jacket. "I'm sure I put the jelly babies in here." He rummaged through the pockets. Nice jacket." Bernice sat on the floor. "Doctor, are you never afraid of the monsters?" "What monsters?" he replied, pulling out a felt hat from the jacket pocket. "The monsters you meet on your travels. Cybermen, Daleks, you know. They aren't monsters. They're alien races with their own agendas, plots and dreams. His voice slowed. But there are monsters out there. Very real monsters. Monsters which shadow us, that are part of our imagination. He pulled out an empty sweet bag and looked disappointed. He kicked the console in irritation, and the TARDIS groaned. It was impossible to know whether the Doctor had caused something to happen, or if it was a coincidence, but the TARDIS began to make a wheezing sound, signalling that it was landing. Bernice was thrown onto the floor, and the Doctor followed, falling over his companion. The TARDIS was materializing. The vidscreen projected a black and white hologram. It was of a small old man with black robes, shaven head, and furious burning eyes. The chain of high office hung around his neck. This was the Archon, the supreme ruler of the Althosian system, the 7 planets and the immeasurable asteroids that lay in between. The 4 androids waited to hear the message before they parachuted down to the planet. They knew that they were on a very special mission. They supported their leader without question, and had all vowed to follow him to hell and back, if that ever proved to be necessary. Thomas prayed every night to the Prime Mover, for the survival and prosperity of the man who had ruled Nicaea and its former colonial worlds since the revolt against the corporation 3 years ago. Thomas would lay his artificial life down for the great man. At a time like this, our world needs your strength here, and in the days ahead I will be thinking of you. What you do now is for the safety and security of our alliance. These criminals cannot be allowed to succeed. They must be annihilated. There can be no negotiation, no settlement with terrorists. The line faded, as if the Archon had been distracted back on the homeworld. Who would hold our whole way of life to ransom? Destroy, destroy! I say destroy their very existence. If anyone could achieve those results, I know it is my shock troops. The Archon paused, looking away as if being addressed by someone else in the room. The line began to crackle, and the image of the old man disappeared. Just as quickly, the hologram returned. The Archon was rushed and tried to hurry his prepared speech. You will not be returning, but you will live on in the memories of our entire race. You must carry out your mission. I now tell you that my order is irrevocable, and under no circumstances must you default from the prime task. Destroy the missile and wipe out the criminals, and let our nation rejoice in your success. The Archon nodded, probably to the vid-camera operator. The hologram receded. Spike looked around the small task force. Let us pray for the success of the mission. The 4 knelt in silent prayer. Although prayer was a mere formality in military circles, Thomas had faith that the Prime Mover was a personal deity who would look after all believers. I serve. Major Carlson entered the room. He moved his arm to his chest, saluting the Archon. The vid equipment was being packed up by the technicians. The permanent studio, within Parliament, was being closed during the state of crisis. Various pieces of equipment were being moved to the Imperial Palace in case it became necessary for the Archon to address his people directly. Carlson shuffled. He was uneasy. He had been ordered to attend Parliament for a briefing session with General Copy-Ion, his commander. He could still do with a drink. The technicians finished packing and left the room. The Archon was sitting on a box, listening to the General advising him about the current situation on the unnamed planet. Copy-Ion stood in the corner of the room in darkness. He was a military man with a shock of white hair, a small beard around his mouth, and an aristocratic ponytail. He had only one arm, gold teeth, and a large facial wound, all scars of battle. Tiredness seemed to hang around him, as if the present conflict was too much of a burden for him. The Major could see that the secret police might have a new commander in the near future. Copy-Ion had been one of the first settlers and had created the Justice Police. He still owned Mirage Enterprises, the company which built the androids. Carlson had been 24 when he had travelled out to the Althosian system. The 7 planets were far from the usual trading routes and many years' travel from the nearest Earth colony. This was how they had managed to win their independence so easily from the corporation. He had been a security officer on one of the deep space freight lines. He had felt it was time to settle down and had chosen to stay on Nicaea. He applied for the Justice Police, he had been interviewed, selected, and had proven his skills over the last decade. He had risen up the ranks and was now a deputy commander. His remit was to investigate internal crimes. There were about 70 androids used by the Justice Police, but they were placed in the external defence force, the political section, or the smuggling and immigration section. He had no androids under his direct control. Copy Ion was a dictator. He told his 4 deputies as little as necessary for the implementation of his wishes. No one will ever know about their mission, apart from the 3 of us in this room now. Misunderstandings would occur if our enemies were to find out about the theft of Pandora's box, Copy Ion said. This is the reason for sending androids from my Justice Police. We aren't able to trust the military at this moment in time, the Archon said. Do we know any more about the criminals? We've been unable to ascertain more information, the Major said. Copy Ion walked over to the Archon and handed him a file. We are writing on paper at the moment. Hackers are trying to break into the computer system. Arrest them, the Archon retorted. We are feeding them false information and monitoring the results of the disinformation. We can find out more and identify our enemies with greater certainty, said the Major. Copy Ion looked annoyed. He had told Carlson that he felt he was prone to reveal his hand too early. The Major felt that the Archon should be told all the information they had. He was the leader of the Federation, and all Justice officers swore an oath of allegiance directly to him. Copy Ion continued. The androids have the following information. Using recording equipment on the airbase, we have identified the criminals as Butler and Swarf, shape changers who have been involved in mercenary and serious criminal activities on colony worlds elsewhere in the galaxy. Shape changers? The Archon seemed puzzled. They appear to have a remarkable physiology, which allows them to mutate at will into any shape or form of their choosing, Copy Ion said. I wouldn't have thought that was possible, said the Archon. Copy Ion shrugged. Although this means that we have nothing to worry about. They are simply criminals. We don't know why they took the missile, but they are only criminals. It's not our enemies who have stolen this weapon. Copy Ion walked around the gutted vidscreen studio. All our information would suggest that Butler and Swarf have always been hired by other people. They are simply criminals, but I am unable to tell who has employed them. The Archon sighed. I am trying to save our civilization. We are about to enter a war none of us, I'm sure, wants. I need information. That weapon is the most devastating nuclear device ever created. We don't have it anymore, and we don't know who does. Copy Ion shrugged his shoulders. The Archon waved his hand. He had heard enough. My troops are ready to return you to the Imperial Palace, said Copy Ion. Thank you, but give me a few moments, replied the Archon. Copy Ion bowed his head and left the room. The Major saluted and followed his commander. Copy Ion seemed thoughtful. The corridors of Parliament were empty and quiet. The hustle and bustle had stopped. Footsteps echoed around the halls as civil servants hurried by, carrying boxes of papers from dingy offices into waiting hovercars. Parliament seemed to have been abandoned. Sir, I haven't got any further with the murder, Carlson said. No, Copy Ion replied. Carlson had spent 2 days investigating the last few hours of the young victim. He hadn't been home and had managed only a quick phone call to his wife last night. She was used to his job, but it was still a strain. You'd better go home, said Copy Ion. Carlson smiled. Sometimes the commander seemed to read his mind. He would answer questions that had not yet been asked. Sir, he said. The Dragon Slayer continued its circular path over the surface of the unknown world. The 4 androids were studying information being received from monitoring equipment on the exterior of the ship, trying to pinpoint Butler and Swarth on the huge planet. External microphones and heat sensors were pointed in the direction of the planet's surface. The ship was the most technologically advanced machine built by their civilization, a civilization which invested much in military security. The Dragon Slayer, with its stock of nuclear warheads and chemical and biological and electronic weapons, contained the kill power to pacify any Class 3 type planet. It had flown over a dozen combat missions and had returned virtually unscathed. The Dragon Slayer class of interstellar gunships were based on insect models. They were seen as an ideal blueprint for fast-moving attack craft. Its shape was like a wasp's, with a smooth outer surface which felt like warm glass. Inside the ship, strange substances recycled and gurgled through pipes around the androids' heads. A constant chatter of voices from radio transmissions picked up from other planets played over the loudspeakers. These were analysed and fed into the computer brain. Dust and rubbish lay strewn over the crew area. Androids had no sense of cleanliness, and wherever they were found, there was also debris and waste. The defence and attack modes of the craft could be launched with no animated life on board. There were environments in which it had been foreseen that even the android killers would have difficulties functioning. Androids had some of the senses of living creatures. Thomas found the hum of the ship and the incessant chatter from the loudspeakers extremely distracting. The air conditioning also made the craft too cold. Sometimes it felt like standing in a wind tunnel. He shivered, not with the cold, but because of thoughts about what lay ahead of them, and because of the self-doubt, always the self-doubt, that he would not be able to serve his controllers as they so wished. He thought the strict separation between those alive and a second-class, machines, sprang from sheer ignorance, and he believed that the Prime Mover treated all life forms alike. All 4 soldiers were now dressed in their battle armour. It was lightweight plastic, able to camouflage the wearer in a variety of situations. It also contained the inbuilt technological firepower to respond to most emergencies. The androids had been originally developed to fight insurrectionists and the occasional hunter. Hunters were aliens, apparently native to the Althosian system, who were able to survive in space. They dropped into the outer colony worlds, hunting the inhabitants for food. They were one of the main reasons that this distant star system was not seen as prime colony material. The hunters were very nasty beasts, with lots of teeth. Thomas didn't have any fond memories of his last battle with one. He had been the only survivor of a 10-man crew. Perhaps that was why he had been chosen for this mission. Cheney handed him a set of photographs taken from the external cameras. All Thomas could see was a set of concentric circles. There was a possible fault in the photographic equipment. Discordant images revealed an inadequacy in the gunship's technology. "We have a problem," Cheney stated the obvious. He was a large man, built like a gorilla, and not renowned for his intelligence. "I can't get any close-ups," continued Cheney, not able to recognize when no one was listening or interested. "This machine is capable of taking highly detailed photos up to a millimeter from deepest space. But I'm not getting anything. The machine is—" Cheney hit it with considerable violence. He believed that brute force would win out in the end. "Don't damage the equipment," instructed Spike. He had an air of authority. This didn't come from his 2.5-meter stature or his shock of red hair, but from genetically created leadership qualities. All previous android models, which had failed to display the right degree of superiority, were destroyed prior to registration. "Anything, lover boy?" Marilyn was still watching Thomas. He had control of the sound equipment and had been trying to concentrate on the sounds of the planet. So little was known about this unnamed planet at the edge of the Althosian system. Not yet. Suddenly Thomas heard something. According to the computer analysis of the sounds, it was a creature moving through a jungle environment. Something which had been very still was careering through the undergrowth. The amplifiers echoed the sounds around the ship. "I can't tell the size of it," he admitted. "Only the one, though?" the commander asked. "Yes, I think so." "Right, final stages, ready for the drop," shouted Spike. "I'm not sure," Thomas tried to say. Marilyn shook her head. "Lover boy, you're going to have to do better." The loudspeakers played the sounds of branches being broken. The androids followed Spike's orders, putting their parachutes on quickly and efficiently. If things were going to go wrong on this mission, Thomas thought, it wouldn't be due to their failure to follow orders. Cheney answered for all of them. "Ready." Marilyn made a last check on their distance from the planet's surface. She was unable to specify what they were parachuting down to. "Any sign of other life down there?" Spike asked. "No," Marilyn replied. After a few moments' silence, Spike made the decision. "Out! Remember, no radio contact." Spike patted them all on the back as they leapt from the gunship. Down to the planet below. Thomas felt the shrieking cold as he fell through the atmosphere. Would this be a silent death? He could see Spike in the hatchway of the ship, watching, turning his tracking control on, and throwing himself after his troops. The Dragon Slayer automatically closed its hatch and armed itself. Countdown 71 hours, 59 minutes, 50 seconds. Its orders were unusual. To deliver 4 androids to the planet without a name, on the border of the star system. A planet that interplanetary law forbids all life forms having any contact with. Did the androids know what lurked down on the planet waiting for them? The machine had no name in its memory banks, but it knew, and the androids didn't. Not yet, anyway.